Good day. I think today, rather than concentrate as I've tended to do over the movements of troops and soldiers in Ukraine itself, something which, as I've said many times, I'm not the best qualified person to do, and which others far more qualified than me, like Jacob Dreisen, for example, at the Dreisen Report, and Andrei Matyanov, whom, by the way, we're calling in shortly for a program on Monday, and I'm hoping that we'll be able to get Jacob also on our programs before very long. Anyway, those sort of people do it much better than I am able to do. As I said many times, I don't particularly have a military background. My overall impression, briefly, about the war is that it is going very much in the way that I've been discussing over the last few sessions, my last few programs, a steady grinding down of Ukrainian troops in Donbass, with apparently some statements now coming from Ukraine itself, from the government in Kiev, that loss of Donbass would not be fatal for Ukraine. It would not be the end of the war. Ukraine can continue fighting even if it's been defeated, or rather if its troops withdraw from Donbass. Apparently, Arestovich, that's to say President Zelensky's spokesman, has even given an interview to that effect, though I want to stress I haven't seen or read anywhere this interview, and it may be that this is a misrepresentation of his actual words. Misrepresentations in this war happen all over the place and all the time. It's interesting to see that Ukraine today, or rather the Ukrainian Air Force today, finally laid the myth of the ghost of Kiev, this heroic fighter pilot who shot down single-handed 40 Russian aircraft, that they finally laid this particular ghost to rest, admitting that no such person ever existed. But anyway, I'm going to make just a few very brief observations about the war. The first is, as I said, the situation continues, much as I've discussed on other occasions. Russians grinding the Ukrainian forces down in eastern Ukraine, with the Ukrainians continuously suffering extremely heavy losses. And secondly, it seems, or at least I've been told, that the most intense fighting at the moment and the major point of battle is at a place called Popasnaya, town of about 20,000 people. Roughly half of it is now controlled by the militia, the Donbass militia, and they've been trying steadily to edge the Ukrainian army out of Popasnaya. Apparently, Popasnaya is an important hub and sector in the Ukrainian defense forces in Donbass, and perhaps it's a more important battle that's been fought out there than I have previously realized and have discussed in other programs. I would say that, in my opinion, the one part of the news that I am able to discuss, I think, reasonably intelligently in terms of the situation in Ukraine on the ground, is the fact that after the Russian missile strikes on Ukrainian refineries and oil facilities, and also the railway system, we're now getting mounting reports of a fuel crisis across Ukraine, with Zelensky himself admitting that there is such a crisis, with cars unable to tank up with petrol, and of course, in time and over the next few days and weeks, that I presume is going to have a significant impact on the conduct of the Ukrainian military. The other news that we've had, which is interesting and perhaps important, is that with the involvement of the United Nations and of the Swiss Red Cross, it does seem that civilians are now starting to dribble out of the Azovstal factory, and perhaps certain places just adjacent to it where they have been hiding. It seems that the Ukrainian commanders within the Azovstal factory have relented and are letting these people go, and apparently more and more of them are choosing to go. Now, where that leaves the garrison once they've all left is, of course, another matter. Apparently they're running out of food. Once all the civilians are gone, or once the Russians believe that all the civilians have gone, I presume that they will resume shelling, heavy bombing, artillery strikes, missile strikes and the rest at this factory, at which point the life expectancy of the Ukrainian garrison in the Azovstal factory would become extremely short, even putting aside the reports that it's slowly running out of food. I wonder whether the decision by the commanders at Azovstal to let the civilians go, or at least to let some of the civilians go, isn't an indicator that they're finally working towards doing that thing which they should have done weeks ago, which is finally surrender and give up the factory. Now, I say that, I think they should have done that, as I said, weeks ago. And I'm going to also add that if it is indeed the case that there are discussions in Kiev, or even admissions in Kiev, that the situation in Donbass is lost, then I think Ukraine should have decided to pull its troops out of Donbass also weeks ago, or at least days ago. And the decision to keep these troops in Donbass, to allow them to stay there, to be steadily crushed by the Russian and allied military, well, I think that was both callous and a serious mistake. But anyway, it is the larger picture, the bigger diplomatic picture that I want to come to, because I think we're now starting to get a sense of where this war is going, or at least where this war is going from a Western point of view. Now, let's take a few reels back and remember what happened in March. In March, the Russian operation was taking place in earnest. The Russians were camped outside Kiev. They'd also encircled Chernigov and Sumy, and they had not yet completed their encirclement of the troops in Donbass, but it was clear that that was where the war was eventually heading towards. And negotiations were at that point underway, firstly in Minsk, in Belarus, through the intermediary of Alexander Lukashenko, the Belarusian president, and then in Turkey, with an eventual meeting of Russian and Ukrainian negotiators in Istanbul. And as I discussed at the time, the Ukrainian negotiators came to Istanbul with proposals. Now, those proposals didn't go anywhere close to meeting overall Russian demands, but they did come very close to do, at least they did show movement, significant movement in that direction. Ukraine appeared to accept that it would not ever join NATO, that it would have neutral status. It did seek security guarantees from various of the great powers, but it accepted that there could not be military exercises, stationing of troops, or bases established on Ukrainian territory without Russian agreement. And though they did not recognize that Crimea had become a part of Russia, and they did not recognize that Donbass was becoming independent, they did accept that Crimea and Donbass would not be covered by these security guarantees, which appeared to differentiate them from all of the rest of the territory that Kiev claims belongs to Ukraine. And the Russians took away these proposals, said that they represented progress, and there was talk about de-escalation. And the Russians used these proposals as grounds or pretext to do what I suspect they were already minded to do, which was to pull their troops away from Kiev, Chernigov, Sumy, and those places, so that they could be concentrated in the Battle of Donbass. Anyway, a few days after the seeming progress in Istanbul, we got reports that the British were very concerned about the concessions the Ukrainians were making, and there'd been a telephone call to Zelensky by Prime Minister Boris Johnson, in which basically Johnson urged Zelensky to take back the concessions. And one gets the increasing sense that the United States has been applying the same pressure. And eventually, Ukraine did take back the concessions. And as a result, as both Ukraine and Russia confirm, the negotiating process, which was active in March and seemed to be making genuine progress, has now ground to a complete stop. And there is essentially no progress in the negotiations taking place at all, and no sign that either Ukraine or Russia feel that these negotiations are leading anywhere. And I think it's become increasingly clear what happened. The Ukrainians were told to pull back from these concessions, and in return, they were promised enormous amounts of military aid from the West, with the objective, or at least the stated objective, no longer being to help Ukraine defend itself, but supposedly to enable Ukraine to achieve victory over Russia. An extraordinary proposition, a fantastic idea, but over the last few weeks, we've been seeing dribbles of articles in various places suggesting that that is the actual intended or announced plan. And we're also getting statements from various Western leaders which appear to confirm this. So Lloyd Austin has said that the project is to weaken Russia. Jens Stoltenberg is talking about a war in Ukraine that may last years. And we now hear others like Liz Truss talking about the fact that the only outcome that is acceptable is victory, a victory which Crimea as well as Donbass are returned to Ukraine. And Annalena Baerbock, the extremely hawkish German foreign minister, has also said that the Russians need to pull out all their troops from Ukraine. She doesn't make it clear what she means by Ukraine, or at least the transcripts that I've seen don't seem to make that clear, but I suspect it means Crimea and Donbass as well, at least in her mind. So war going on for years without end, with Ukraine being supplied by large amounts of Western weapon systems to make up for all the weapons that Ukraine is losing and for all the people who are dying in Ukraine. Well, that seems to be the plan at the moment. Now, can I say straight away that if that is the plan, it is both a terrible plan and it is a deeply immoral and callous plan. Firstly, it is immoral and callous because this is a recipe for war. And if Western leaders get what they want, more and more people in Ukraine are going to die. And by far the greater number of those are going to be Ukrainians. And we're seeing that happen all the time. There are reports, now of course I can't confirm these, but there are reports that hundreds of Ukrainian soldiers are either dying or being put out of action in Ukraine every day. And prolonging the war in that kind of way is going to mean that Ukrainians are also going to continue dying at probably something like the same rate. And I suspect, I am sure that Russians are dying as well. And of course, people from the Donbass militia who are, I suppose, in Western eyes, also Ukrainians, are also dying. I would add, by the way, and in parenthesis, that if you follow the Western media, they barely refer at any time to the Donbass militia, even though it has been the major force fighting the Ukrainian army in places like Mariupol, on the outskirts of Donetsk, in Popasnaya, and near the Severodonetsk conurbation. So it's quite remarkable how this force is being completely ignored. The impression given that it is entirely the Russian army, or exclusively the Russian army, that is fighting the Ukrainians. It has been a consistent pattern of the Western media and of the Western governments ever since the 2014 crisis to simply ignore the existence of these people who are fighting from Donbass in eastern Ukraine. And of course, the reason for that is that they don't want to acknowledge a larger truth about this war, which is that it is at some level also a civil war within Ukraine, as well as a conflict now between Ukraine and Russia. So, as I said, it's a deeply immoral project because what it is essentially doing is it's setting the bar for negotiations so high as to prolong war indefinitely, and it is going to be a war in which lots of people are going to die. But it does something else, and that is that, in my opinion, it guarantees the destruction of Ukraine. Now, I say that I am well aware of the vast sums of money that are now being devoted to supplying Ukraine with weapons. And of course, we've now had the Lend-Lease proposals in the United States, in which, by the way, Ukraine will have to borrow money, rather will have to obtain weapon systems from the United States, but will have to pay for them at some point after, when the hostilities are over, thereby falling into massive debt in the process. We've had the $33 billion proposal from President Biden, one which I understand even some people in Congress are balking at, and are wondering what exactly it means and what the end game is. There was apparently a disastrous session with Secretary Blinken in Congress, in which he was unable to provide any clear answers to the questions about what the United States really wants to achieve in Ukraine. That's another matter for another day. And then, of course, we've also get all these reports of dribs and drabs of weapon systems being supplied by the United States' NATO allies. So, a couple of armoured vehicles from Britain, a few clapped-out tanks and armoured vehicles from Germany, about 4 or 6 self-propelled artillery pieces from France, 200 old tanks from Poland, reducing, by the way, the size of Poland's tank force by half. All of these weapon systems being sent to Ukraine. But of course, it'd be the US which will eventually have to do most of the heavy lifting. Except, of course, there have already been reports that much of the material that's been sent to Ukraine has not been working terribly well. So I've already discussed how drones, the US Switchblade drones, seem not to have been particularly effective against the kind of integrated air defense system that the Russian army operates under. Here's one further reports that Stinger anti-aircraft missiles, which it turns out are mostly 20 years old and have been out of production for around 18 years, are proving less than stellar in their effectiveness. And there's even reports, which of course I can't obviously confirm, that the Javelin system has not been particularly successful or effective either. As for the guns, the howitzers, the 100 howitzers that the United States is delivering, well, again, one has to say that they don't seem to me to be of the kind that would make a decisive difference. The United States has acknowledged that the scale of Ukrainian battlefield losses is enormous, and these howitzers, which there's no reason to believe are superior in any essential way to the kind of artillery pieces that the Russians or indeed the Ukrainians have, are going to make a dramatic difference. As for the M113 armoured vehicles, these are so-called battlefield taxis. They're not infantry fighting vehicles. They were designed in the 1950s. They are essentially death traps if sent into battle, which of course they never are. And anyway, it's unlikely they'll be sent anywhere close to the battle lines. But of course, what all this vast armoury of weapons, except of course it's not actually such a vast armoury of weapons, is going to do, it's going to complicate Ukrainian logistics. It's going to make it more difficult in some ways for Ukraine to organize its forces effectively. And of course, if the Russians continue their missile strikes on the transport infrastructure, on the oil refineries, on the fuel places, the ammunition dumps up and down Ukraine, well, it's difficult to see how these weapon systems are going to even reach the front lines. According to the Prime Minister of the Donetsk People's Republic, there's no sign so far that they've managed to do so. and nor does there seem to be any evidence that if they do reach the front lines, they're going to make any significant difference to the fighting there. But what this does threaten, what this does do, what it contains the grain of doing, is that, of course, it increases even further the political investment of Western governments in this war. If they've now committed themselves to an unachievable objective of defeating Russia in Ukraine, then as it becomes increasingly clear that that objective is unachievable, as it becomes increasingly clear also that areas of Russian control are going to start expanding, as Donbass falls, and I've discussed already how there seems to be increasing recognition on the Ukrainian side that Donbass is indeed going to be lost. As Donbass falls, as the Russians steadily and incrementally increase their control of Ukraine's coast, cutting Ukraine off from the Black Sea, well, this commitment to Ukraine, which will not be easy to take back, looks increasingly like becoming a kind of black hole. Because, of course, at that point, you can't let Ukraine visibly lose or go down defeated, because if you do that, then Western governments are humiliated, and there is a major crisis for the United States and for NATO in Europe. And at the same time, you can't at the same time achieve victory. So what do? You continue, presumably, to double down. And you start sending more weapons, more advisors. There's now lots of advisors, apparently, in Ukraine. And eventually you start talking about sending combat troops. And of course, we've already heard reports about Polish and Romanian troops being concentrated around Ukraine's borders, though nobody quite knows what these troops are supposed to do. But anyway, we get all of those reports as well. Polish, Romanian troops being gathered around its borders. And then, of course, if those troops go into Ukraine and get into trouble, if the Russians attack them with hypersonic missiles, if they start demanding and requesting help from the United States, what then? Does the United States walk away? Does it leave these troops to be knocked about by the Russians so badly that perhaps they have to scuttle back to their respective countries, with the populations and the governments of those countries feeling betrayed by the United States? Or does the United States take further steps to try and double down and to protect and to support these troops, even as hypersonic missiles rain down upon them? All of this, I have to say, this is starting increasingly to remind me of the war in Vietnam in the 1960s. Now, can I say what actually happened in Vietnam? Because this is a complicated story, but I'm going to provide a very simple version of it. Vietnam was, of course, an country, which had been part of the French colonial empire. There was a war, an independence war against France in the 1940s and early 1950s. The Vietnamese, led by a man called Ho Chi Minh and his Viet Minh, won that war. Ho Chi Minh, of course, was a communist, and he was allied with the Soviets and with the Chinese. Anyway, Ho Chi Minh won, and there was a peace agreement negotiated in 1954 in a place called Geneva. And the basis of the agreement was that for a temporary period, Vietnam would be divided into two areas: North Vietnam, which would come under Ho Chi Minh's immediate and direct rule, and South Vietnam, which would be administered for a time separately, primarily by the French. And the plan was that there would then be an election in 1958, encompassing the whole of Vietnam, and the universal assumption was that Ho Chi Minh would win the election. There were reports that he was expected to win around 80% of the vote in the event that such an election had taken place. Anyway, that proved unacceptable to the United States and to other Western powers, and the Geneva Agreement was breached, was ignored, much like the Minsk Agreement over Ukraine was also ignored. A peace agreement that might have settled the Vietnam crisis peacefully was repudiated by the Western powers, just like the Minsk agreement, which might also have resolved the situation in Ukraine, was repudiated by the Western powers. And what then happened was that the United States backed the setting up of a parallel government in South Vietnam, led by a man called Diem, who was in some ways a very interesting and very extraordinary and rather able man, but also very eccentric, with some rather strange views and also deeply corrupt. And of course, South Vietnam, under his leadership, did achieve a certain political identity, but it also became a deeply corrupt country. Again, parallels with Ukraine today are not entirely, the parallels are indeed there. Anyway, Diem also did what one might have expected, and what the Ukrainian government has also been doing over the last 8 years. It took action. Diem took action to crush Ho Chi Minh's supporters in South Vietnam, communists, of course, just as the Ukrainian government over the last 8 years has been working hard to extinguish pro-Russian sentiment across Ukraine. And eventually, this became extremely difficult for the communists in Vietnam, just as it became for the holdouts, the pro-Russian holdouts in Donbass, who came under increasing pressure, and eventually the communists in Vietnam. In 1960, at a meeting in 1960, appealed for help to their comrades in North Vietnam, just as a few weeks ago the pro-Russian groups in Donbass appealed to Russia. And on both occasions, it was politically impossible for the respective leaders, Ho Chi Minh in the case of Vietnam, Vladimir Putin in the case of Russia, to say no. And the result was North Vietnamese intervention in South Vietnam in support of the Vietnamese communists in South Vietnam, who came to be called the Viet Cong, and of course Russian intervention, as we're seeing now in Ukraine. And what we see is exactly the same response from the United States in both cases. Firstly, weapon systems sent in vast numbers to Ukraine, to Vietnam, just as they're being sent to Ukraine. Then advisors being sent to both countries. And then, as none of this works, as it becomes clear that the governments in both of these countries are not capable of defeating the enemy by themselves, increasing calls from various people for intervention, with increasingly hardline comments, extreme comments often made, not from within the United States, but from some of the United States' allies. And the result is a steady uptick of escalation. In the case of Vietnam, it eventually resulted in 500,000 American troops being sent to Vietnam and becoming involved in the war there. In Ukraine, will we see the same thing? We will see action like that being taken against a nuclear superpower, which is, of course, Russia? Well, I sincerely hope not. Now, if you go back and follow media commentary in the United States and in some of its allies in the lead up to the intervention in Vietnam, you will find much the same belligerence, much the same confrontational language, much the same triumphalism when the South Vietnamese gained the odd skirmish or seemed to be achieving some progress, and also increasing demands for more and more action as the situation became increasingly precarious and it became visibly obvious that in spite of everything, South Vietnam was still losing. And I do worry that the same dynamic is now starting to take hold over the conflict in Ukraine. That we're now getting into a situation where the United States, just as was the case in Vietnam, is throwing away opportunities for peace or for a negotiated solution or for some step to try to contain and de-escalate the crisis. It is instead drifting into a position of ever greater escalation, ever greater commitment, ever greater involvement, which has no real clear end point and no clear or achievable end game. The United States never clearly set out what its war aims were in Vietnam, and I don't really see much sign that it's able to do that with respect to Ukraine either. Sometimes you would hear all kinds of extraordinary claims and projections about in Vietnam about all kinds of possible achievements. It was said that if the Vietnamese in the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong were defeated in South Vietnam, that would result in some kind of crisis in Hanoi. And you see some of the same things being said today about Russia. What the war in Vietnam did was that it consolidated in North Vietnam and elsewhere in Vietnam support for the North Vietnamese government, for Ho Chi Minh and for his successors. And I suspect the same thing is going to happen in Russia, and in fact is already happening in Russia. So it seems to me an extremely bad situation, and one in Vietnam, and a similarly bad situation in Ukraine. Now, to answer the objection, history never repeats itself. This is absolutely true. It does sometimes rhyme. And what does repeat itself, I find, is patterns of elite decision-making. In the 1960s, the United States felt itself both extremely self-confident. It was by far the world's most powerful country, but also increasingly nervous and worried that it was losing the strategic initiative. The Soviets had taken the first steps in space. They seem to have consolidated their economic and military hold over Eastern Europe, and there was genuine apprehension in the United States that the Soviets were actually gaining ground in what was at that time called the Cold War. Today, and with far more justification, the United States, they're also feeling itself to be still the world's most powerful country, is becoming increasingly aware that it faces a full spectrum challenge from countries like China and, of course, Russia and other countries too, and that its period of global preeminence is starting to slip. So you get the same dangerous combination of overconfidence and insecurity at one and the same time. And, of course, on top of this problem of overconfidence and insecurity, you also get the immense difficulties which existed both in the early 1960s, in the early and mid-1960s, in the United States, and of course in the United States today, the great difficulty in negotiating, in coming to effective and substantive agreements with the other side. There's been many instances of this. There were many instances of this back in the 50s and 60s. The United States struggled to achieve any kind of effective negotiations in that period with the Soviets on any significant matter. It took the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 before negotiations on any real substantive issue began to really move forward. And you see the same again. And of course you see again how in the 1950s and 1960s, the United States would pull back from agreements like the 1954 Geneva Agreement, which could have settled peacefully the crisis in Vietnam. And of course, we've seen the same pattern in Ukraine with the Minsk Agreement and other agreements like this. Every time there's movement towards a negotiated solution, hardliners, hawks as they were called back in the 1960s, neocons as they're called today, mobilized to block that negotiation as they demand instead ever greater levels of escalation. Well, In the 1960s, eventually, this all provoked a political crisis in the United States, massive protests there. It also provoked an economic crisis. And eventually, after much heart searching and rethinking, there was a pullback and a negotiation. And we had that brief period in the late 1960s and early to mid 1970s, known as détente, a kind of geopolitical ceasefire between the two great powers, the Soviets and the Americans, of a kind that I've argued for in many programs on this channel. Will the same happen this time? Well, I don't know, but I will say this: the stakes this time are immeasurably greater. Because make no mistake about it, if the United States commits itself to a war, an indefinite war in Ukraine, and then loses that war, then the entire American position, the entire Western position in Europe will be fatally undermined. In the 1970s, when South Vietnam eventually collapsed, the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization that the United States had been trying to build up as a kind of Pacific parallel to NATO, well, SEATO crumbled. But to be straightforward about it, SEATO never really amounted to very much, and its disappearance from the geopolitical scene arguably made no real difference. Well, with NATO, it's different. If Ukraine loses, if NATO states, other NATO states, seeing a defeat in Ukraine, start to conclude that NATO isn't perhaps quite the reliable defender that they imagined, all the more so given that there's disputes about NATO within some of these East European states. I mean, places like Bulgaria, Slovenia, Slovakia, Croatia. Well, it's easy to see how NATO might start, in that case, to crumble. Well, I'm not saying we're there. I'm not saying we're anywhere close to being there. All I am saying is that this massive commitment of supplies to Ukraine is not going to change the overall military picture. It might prolong the war, but not, I think, in the way that the Western powers or the United States expect. What it's far more likely to do is lead to the eventual collapse of Ukraine, just as South Vietnam eventually collapsed. And that would come with very significant and very severe global geopolitical repercussions. And of course, I'm not even going to discuss or touch upon this topic which has been circulating all over the place about whether nuclear war might happen. I would say that there were ideas floated around in the United States during the 1960s, in particular apparently on one occasion, of using a tactical nuclear weapon in Vietnam, but of course that never did happen. And I don't believe that anybody on the Russian side is planning to do that either. I would add that when I read this morning an editorial in The Observer, the Sunday edition of The Guardian, talking about the nuclear threats supposedly coming from Russia, and I followed the link provided, which I was expecting would lead me to these nuclear threats from Russia, I found certainly warnings from the Russians about the dangers of Western forces going into Ukraine, but no mention of nuclear weapons there at all. But anyway, I hope we don't get into those kind of scenarios. I'm not going to even try to analyze them, given how cataclysmically dangerous they would be. Even if, and hopefully it will remain, a conventional war in Ukraine, all I can say is that the consequences of further intervention on anything like the scale that has now been discussed or contemplated is going to lead to only bad outcomes. It will not lead to victory. it will lead to an even bigger defeat. Let's not even talk about defeats. Let's go back to the position we seem to have briefly in March. Let's go back to that kind of negotiated solution. Ukraine realistically is never going to get Crimea back. I think even the Ukrainians understand that. Trying to reinstate Ukrainian control over Crimea would meet enormous hostility from the local people. And, well, one shudders to think what that would involve. I mean, at the very least, I would have thought their expulsion from Crimea. Perhaps something even worse than this. It's not going to happen. And the Russians, no Russian government would ever allow it to happen. The same goes for Donbass. If, as seems likely, the Ukrainians are now thinking of pulling back from Donbass or accepting that at some point they will have to pull back from Donbass, they might as well recognize the reality that Donbass is forever lost. There were, even before the war, some Ukrainians who were saying that trying to cling on to Donbass was weakening Ukraine. It was diluting Ukraine's identity by keeping within Ukraine Russian speakers, people who increasingly self-identify as Russians, who were, shall we say, skeptical, doubtful about their loyalty to Ukraine. So perhaps it's better from a Ukrainian nationalist point of view to pull out of Donbass and to just let it go. So let's go back to those positions that seem to be outlined in March. And let's please ask these hardliners in Washington, in London, and unfortunately also in Berlin, to start thinking more realistically about what they're doing, consider the morality of what they're doing, the cost to Ukraine as well as to Russia of what they're proposing, of a 1 year, 3 year, 10-year war, and instead start to be more realistic and more practical about the objectives and more moral about the outcomes. Now, having said that, I am also always realistic about these things. I don't expect the Western powers, of course, to heed any kind of advice like this, though I am sure they are getting this advice from some of their officials. I doubt very much that there is no one in Berlin or Washington or indeed London who is making these points. But the leaders in control, the Green Party in Germany, which though it's not the biggest party in the coalition, seems essentially to dominate the coalition, something which I find, by the way, completely bizarre. The administration in Washington, the government in London, which is looking increasingly fractured, they seem to be determined to press on until, well, heavens knows what, but certainly until disaster strikes, or at least that's what they're saying at the moment. But I'm sure, as I said, that this advice is being given behind the scenes to ministers, to officials, by people within the permanent bureaucracies in the Pentagon, in the United States, from the Defense Ministry and the Foreign Ministry in London, and from whatever equivalents exist in Berlin. But I do ask myself whether perhaps these policies, which are going to be pursued apparently for the next year, to be realistic, whether at some point somebody's going to start to understand within the political class how dangerous and unsustainable they are. Already we see, as I discussed in my previous program, that the Europeans are now heading crazily towards an embargo on Russian oil, denying themselves Russian oil in the face of a contracting supply situation in oil altogether. And this comes just as I've read reports that around 50% of French nuclear reactors are currently out of order and are not operating, and that this problem is apparently going to continue into next year. There's an inflation crisis stalking Europe. There's an inflation crisis stalking the United States. There's hunger spreading across the world. And we mustn't underestimate the levels of hardship that people in Europe, in the United States, in Britain are already suffering. Let us put aside these deluded ideas of victory. Let us come instead to a practical realization that this process, which has been caused by a series of massive mistakes and geopolitical miscalculations, is doing the West no good at all and could end in disastrous failure. And let us try and compromise whilst we still can. To be very clear, any return to the situation which existed between Russia and the West, not before 24th February 2022, but frankly before 21st February 2014, is now impossible. Neither the Russians nor the Europeans and the Americans, none of these countries any longer trust each other. I'm getting reports from Russia, and they speak of a huge disillusionment and anger and mistrust of the West that now pervades the entire population, including the political class. I accept that the Russians and the West are going to now move irrevocably in different economic directions. But an angry divorce is better than an outright war, and it is certainly better than the geopolitical disaster that is now being threatened. Will this be heeded? Will we see some sense eventually start to trickle through? I don't know. Let's wait and see. Thank you for joining me today. I look forward to you joining me in future programs on this channel and on our main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou. Remember how you can join us on Rumble and Locals. And remember, if you press the red maroon button on Rumble, if you see watching one of our videos there, that will take you directly to our Locals homepage, where you can join our thriving community, participate in my Wednesday live streams, publish your own exclusive content, and comment on the exclusive content published by others, including myself now on Locals. And you can also find us on other platforms like this free speech platform SuperU. You can support us through Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. You can go to our shop, buy the great things that you will find there, our hats, hoodies, sweatshirts, t-shirts, mugs, and all the rest. And thank you again for joining me today. If you've enjoyed or liked this video, please remember to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon, and have a very good day.